Hello there, my name's Joseph Humfrey and I'm co-founder of Inkle. So I'd like to talk to you about the way that text is presented in games and how it can be done in such a way to make text feel really pleasant to read and to make reading feel effortless. So by the way, this talk is going to be really similar to one that I gave at GDC this year. So my company, Inkle, is responsible for making a couple of pretty successful games, narrative games called Sorcery and 80 Days. They're both games that are told primarily through the medium of text. They're interactive fiction games. And even though they contain hundreds of thousands of words of interactive text, they should still feel like a playing experience rather than a reading experience, one where players go on an incredible adventure, but where they just happen to accidentally end up reading large quantities of text. So I'm primarily a programmer, but I'm also a UX designer, and with my UX design hat on, my goal is to make reading feel so effortless that it barely feels like you're reading at all. Twitter isn't a reading experience, online shopping isn't, watching a film with subtitles isn't a reading experience either. So we started out making games for mobile, which is a really great medium for reading and interactive reading as well. And clearly we weren't the only ones thinking along these lines. There have been loads of beautiful text-based experience produced on iOS especially. But actually the movement hasn't been clearly hasn't been limited to the smartphone revolution either. Popular text-based games have been on the rise on PC as well. There's clearly a lot of momentum in the text game space, perhaps connected to the indie revolution in general, a push back against massive high-budget AAA games. But now at Inkle, we're trying to bring text games to the console space. Making text games for smartphones and tablets totally made sense. But Heaven's Vault is a game where you read text on a TV on the other side of the room. What could possibly go wrong? So our approach to making reading feel effortless relies on two things: good writing and good UX design. And those two things are really closely related. A well-worded sentence, a well-structured paragraph allows for good user experience. And I'll talk a little bit about the writing, but I'm not a writer myself. My focus at Inkle is as a developer and a UX and UI designer. So really this whole talk is just going to be a series of hopefully useful tips and tricks, but they all contribute to what I see as our two major pillars of text UX: focus and pacing. Focus is making sure that the player isn't distracted in the moment, making sure that the text is presented really clearly and that there's zero friction between the reader and their words. Ideally, the player doesn't have to think, the words simply drop into their brain. Focus isn't about the player having to concentrate, but rather the opposite. The game is focused so that reading is effortless for the player. So I'll start with a quick example. I'm a fan of using really tiny amounts of text in presentations. It means that you're listening to what I'm saying instead of being torn between listening and reading what's on the slide. And if I do want you to read something, I can be sure you will if there's a small amount of text on screen. It's effortless. To give you a counterexample from The Witcher, so on the surface, this looks like a really pretty screenshot. The aesthetics are lovely. But do you honestly feel like reading the text? Of course not. It's a wall of text surrounded by distractions, really pretty icons in the UI and really nice character art. They're all doing everything that they can to grab your attention. So let's try a really quick redesign of just the text flow. Okay, that's a pretty good start. We've wiped the slate clean, no distractions. And we're going to begin by revealing the title to the player, but just the title, just to give it a sense of significance. Oops, you just read the title of the story. And the first sentence. And so it continues. But what if the player doesn't want to read this text? Or go on then, for the sake of the UX, we'll add a back button right down in the corner. But we're definitely not going to draw attention to it. But maybe, just maybe, they'll want to read the text anyway and not just dismiss it because it's boring in-game text content. Of course, this takes a bit longer to design and build than a little dialog box, but to be honest, this isn't rocket science. And if you don't care enough about the text content to devote a little bit of development time to making it pleasant to read, why would you pay writers to produce this in the first place? So you might have noticed I've started to touch on pacing. After wiping the slate clean to remove all the distractions, I revealed a little bit of text at a time initially, and then more and more, allowing players a bit of acclimatization time, getting used to the fact that they're no longer juggling inventory items and instead settling into a little bit of reading. Focus and pacing are really closely related, and in fact, quantity of text is a good example of that. The amount of text you show at a time affects both focus and pacing, and never more so than at the start of the game. But other things that affect pacing are the timing of any text animations you have, as well as structure of the writing, since it affects the flow and the timing of how the player reads it. So two important areas that I want to go into more detail on are typography and animation. Generally, typography is more associated with focus and animation is more associated with pacing. So, great typography is really about reducing friction and therefore improving focus. Choosing the right typeface, laying out your text with the right spacing at a good size, it's all important. When choosing a typeface for text that the player will be reading a lot of, the most important thing is readability, and one aspect of this is legibility. What's the difference between readability and legibility? Well, legibility is how easy it is to make out the shape of the letters. To take an extreme example, this fantasy lettering is perfectly legible. It's trivial to work out what the individual letters are. But would you want to read 50,000 words of text in it? I certainly wouldn't. It wouldn't be as readable. And this may be an extreme example. Obviously, you wouldn't typeset an entire book in this typeface. But game artists and designers seem continually tempted to use over-stylized typefaces in an attempt to enrich and enforce the tone and the setting of the game at the expense of the text itself. So you can see it in practice all the time. For example, Elder Scrolls, I love you dearly, but this is not good. The design is a message to the player that this text isn't supposed to be read. It's an artistic prop that happens to have words written on it by an actual writer. It's just one step above lorem ipsum placeholder text, or at least that's the message it's sending. Some intrepid players, myself included, might make a half-hearted attempt to read some of the text as if they're role-playing some kind of bearded, axe-wielding academic, but it's hard work. Here's one from Oblivion. Apologies for the low resolution screenshot. That pretty G initial is cool and everything, but I just have to work that little bit harder in order to read it. Overall, it's not a terrible font, but it just takes that little bit of extra work to read. So here's what I would do if I was to change the font and play with the layout a little bit. So I've just duplicated the content from the right page onto the left page so you can see them side by side. Obviously, the first thing you may notice is that there's simply less text that fits on the left-hand side, so they're not totally equivalent. So what have I done here? The typeface is a variant of Castellon, which originates from the 18th century. So even if you don't know anything about fonts, it will give a relatively aged feel, and I think it had nicer proportions than other serif fonts like Times New Roman. The main thing, though, is that it's not quite so alien to your eyes as the overly stylized version on the right. And in fact, that is the most important thing for readability. Familiarity. Fairly standard-looking serif or sans serif fonts may it be at the more boring end of the spectrum, but if your player is familiar with the style of the font already, it'll be less work to read. More readable. It's about striking a good balance between aesthetics and function. So I've also replaced the decorative initial with a simpler version, just a larger G. It still conveys the impression of being the typography of an old book while being a bit more readable and legible. I've widened the margins, and this is really important. It gives the text room to breathe. Again, it's about focus. Giving that bit of extra white space around the text prevents your eyes getting distracted by other noisy patterns nearby. The other thing that wide margins can do is they convey a sense of importance. If you think about the way poetry looks on a page or a quote with a large border, it makes the message feel significant even if the words aren't. How profound. I've also added a lot of paragraph spacing. You might have noticed that I've also broken up that first paragraph as well. Playing with the structure of the writing is a core part of designing the UX, even if it's the writer who's ultimately responsible for it. So all of this white space prevents your eye getting lost in the flow of text, which is especially important when viewing a TV on the other side of the room. I've also indented the paragraphs. Anecdotally, this made a really surprising difference to the readability in 80 days. The day we added them in, it was really noticeable. The text became so much more relaxing to read. We already had generous paragraph spacing, but those indents are like little anchors that help your eyes zero in on the start of the next paragraph. I should say, by the way, this is a pretty contrived example. If I was really designing the entire thing from scratch, I probably wouldn't put the text flow on pages of a book like this. But right now, we're just looking at the typography in isolation. So, what are my top 5 typography and typesetting tips? We've already talked about typeface and margins and paragraph spacing, which help focus in on the right text and give it a sense of importance. Next on this list is text size. I could probably rant for about an hour about how most console games have tiny, tiny text, probably because the developers sit next to their TV, so they just don't care. Please, if you're a console developer, don't do that. As a rough guide, take a look at film subtitles. It's ridiculously simple UX, but even subtitles on cheap DVD players work fine. If you're designing for both mobile and console, then the screen sizes are surprisingly similar. So when you take into account the player's view distance, the text sizes are basically the same. Of course, text can and should be smaller when you're working on PC, but if you're designing to be multi-platform, it's best to design for mobile or console first, since then you can be sure you'll have enough space. So a rough rule of thumb is that you should be aiming to have around 5 to 15 words per line. At the lower end of the spectrum, you have an effect a bit like a newspaper column. If you go too far beyond 15 words per line, it becomes really difficult for your eye to scan back to the right place on the next line. And I've seen a few narrative games, especially on PC, that put narrative text right down at the bottom of the screen in a really tiny font and stretch it the full width of the screen, giving well over 20 words per line. So I'm really sorry, Witcher, I don't mean to pick on you, but how many words is that per line? I lost count about 30 words in. You might want to leave as much space as possible for the beautiful art above, but if the text is important for the flow of the game, you need to give it room to breathe. I realise these are just subtitles, and they're not the main game UI, but the point still stands. Text positioning. If reading is meant to be the primary activity, then putting it down at the bottom of the screen, the player's attention is going to be split. They want to look at the pretty art, but their eyes necessarily have to be looking away from it at the text down at the bottom. So ideally, and this may be difficult in certain circumstances, but ideally, don't hide your text away in the corner of the screen. Finally, there's one more subtle point that I'm making on this slide. You can make use of text brightness in order to draw the player's attention to what's important right now, darkening previously seen text and highlighting new text. And this really helped in 80 days as well. It makes it really clear to the player where they need to continue from, while allowing them to look back to reread previous parts for context. So all of these typography improvements can help with focus. They help the player concentrate on text that's important and help them absorb it really easily. And I've been showing some examples of static pages of text, but one of the things we've been most happy about and proud of at Inkle is the way that we time the reveal of the text, or the pacing. So I like to think of focus and pacing a bit like harmony and melody. Focus is like harmony, beautiful typography in a single moment, whereas pacing is like melody. how the story flow is presented over time as a sequence. And the pacing is critical right from the beginning, whether that's the beginning of your game or when lots of text appears in an otherwise visual context. I think everyone knows that the first few seconds and minutes are absolutely critical to capturing the player's attention and interest. And with text-based games, this is even more important. Just as people judge books by covers or decide that the first couple of pages of a book don't seem to their taste, you need to convince players that your text isn't intimidating or boring. If your game is primarily text-based, it may also need to present itself gently, telling your players, you're going to have to read a little bit of text, but look, it's fine, it's easy, right? In 80 days, we did exactly what I demonstrated in the early example. We started with a black screen and then just revealed a really small amount of text at a time initially. And we did this multiple times throughout the game, every time you entered a story section. The first thing to do when pacing text content is to break it down into smaller digestible chunks. The BBC News website gives every single sentence its own little paragraph to make it easier to read. But being game developers, we can play with animation, timing, and interactivity as well. It's really just a matter of balance. So, showing small sections of text in isolation can help the player focus on those specific words, slowing them down. It forces them to pause and think. Whereas, showing a single larger section, assuming the player is already focused, allows them to consume the content more quickly. And that can be pretty surprising, actually. Smaller sections are slower, larger sections are faster. So to be clear, I'm talking about these sections in isolation, when you have a pause or press a button when you're able to, in order to read the next section. So necessarily, inserting those gaps will slow down the reading. And if it becomes too slow, it can become boring or frustrating for the player if they can't read fast enough. And it can definitely be surprising. While working on Sorcery, we tried to make a text-based action scene by having little snippets like you leap forward or you make a dash for the door, separated by choices. We thought that a rapid succession of choices would make the story speed up, but actually, of course, it slowed down the reveal of the content itself. So the only way you can solve this kind of thing is by testing and iterating. Since pacing is inherently time-based, it's like animating a character. You can't just author it all assuming that your theories are correct. You've got to keep playing it back. Reading back a script isn't enough. The exact details of the presentation can make a huge difference. So for writers, I'd strongly suggest that you get up and running with the game and get in the habit of playing as you write. In a moment, I'll show some examples and how animation factors into the balance. So we've talked a bit about splitting up content into smaller sections, but that's really only the short-term pacing. It's how the player is reading moment to moment. Longer term, the enemy we have to contend with is fatigue. Imagine a book with paragraphs but no chapter breaks, or a Kindle ebook with no page numbers or a progress bar, or a children's book with no illustrations. Now, this is really dependent on the design of your individual game. So far, we've been discussing focus and pacing across the span of a few seconds, so it's been applicable whether your game is purely text-based or whether it's a game that just happens to have some text-based sections. If your core mechanic relies on reading text, then it can really help to introduce some ancillary mechanics, whether text-based or not, in order to break it up and provide a bit of variety for the player. As the player moves back and forth between different sections, each one will feel satisfyingly fresh again as they enter it. It can also help if you give the player control over this change of activity or use it as a reward. In 80 days, we used to have an identical flow to Sorcery, in that when you arrived in a location, the story flow would pop up immediately. But as soon as we put on an Explore button, suddenly it felt like a player choice, a reward. Putting the player in charge of the decision to read gives them a sense of ownership over the content. For longer sections especially, it can also help to give the player an indication of their overall progress. The page number in a book acts a bit like a score. It can help as a very simple motivator to make progress. It can also give the player a sense that the reader, a sense that their current activity is finite, and that can be reassuring. On the flip side, though, you have to be careful. Sometimes players get past the halfway point. Being given the sense that they're nearly done can really cause them to rush and pay less attention to the content. This is definitely something that happened in 80 Days, and it was exacerbated by the fact that they were meant to be hurrying as part of the game's mechanic. Even though we paused the clock during story sections, there was this really strong instinct to skim read as players got closer to returning to London. Finally, let's talk about animation. Good aesthetics can draw a player in. Gamers are used to having their attention drawn in by eye-catching visuals, so some pretty text animations can give them the feel-good factor before they get drawn in by the story, and make them feel like they're getting something with high production values that's worth their time, even though the true value is in the content. To a point, of course. But animation isn't all about aesthetics. It can be functional too, and this is where things can get really interesting. So this is a screenshot from Sorcery, and it's the story flow. When the player reads a choice, their eye is down at the bottom of the screen where the choices are. When they pick a choice, the piece of paper that the choice is written on slides up and joins the bottom edge of the story flow above, and the body text is revealed. This leads the player's eye back up to the correct point in the story flow, where they have both the context of what they read before, as well as the new text that they can read below. So the animation is leading the eye fluidly to ensure that they don't lose their place. Similarly, this is the text flow in 80 Days, where we went a step further. Often the choices you make are at the start or the end of a sentence, and when that's the case, the choice text itself can be reused and sometimes rearranged slightly as body text. So we animate it into place and then animate the rest of the content in word by word. So what are we doing here to manipulate the pacing? Our word-by-word animation is really quick so that fast readers aren't ever slowed down by it. They don't have to hold down a button to speed it up. However, we do deliberately delay the appearance of choices by less than half a second, so that at the point where the player is unconsciously deciding what to do next, they immediately start reading the highlighted text and they're discouraged from jumping straight down to look at the choices. Also, the fade speed of the choices themselves is so slow that they don't accidentally distract the player from reading the body text. Every animation detail has the ability to either make or break the flow of your story. When you're testing, the important thing is to really pay attention on a fine-grained level to whether your eye is getting lost, or whether you're continually waiting around for just fractions of a second for an animation to complete. On our team, our best aha moments have come when we've jumped into the game to test a feature, and then we've realized that we've forgotten what we were testing, and we end up absent-mindedly getting involved in the story, reading and interacting with it. That's when we know that the UX is really working. So I'd like to show you an example of one of the things that one of the changes that we've made on our latest game, Heaven's Vault. In many ways, it's a tiny, subtle thing, but then I think perhaps tiny, subtle things describes UX in a nutshell. Our interactive script engine, the ink engine, produces character dialogue on a line-by-line basis, which is then presented by the game. Initially, we just showed one line at a time, giving the player just enough time to read it before moving on to the next one. Let me just show you what that looks like by showing a recording of it running in the game. So the pacing just feels a little bit sluggish here. The problem is everyone reads at a different speed, so we can't really display the text for much less time than that. So the small fix that we did was to allow multiple lines of dialogue to overlap and cascade, so new dialogue bubbles can appear while old ones are still on screen. Again, it's quite subtle, but take a look at another recording with this mode switched on. So this meant that the whole thing could be sped up without leaving slower readers behind, since old lines of dialogue stayed on screen for a while. The previous text that's shown on screen helps with context as well, so that's a good bonus. This tiny subtle tweak worked miracles for the pacing of the game overall, and it's these things that can really make or break the experience. So it's just really hard to get exactly right. It's all very well being aware that focus and pacing is important, but the reality is you just have to keep testing and making improvements. Pay close attention to those fractions of a second where you're waiting around for a little delay or an animation, or the tiny moments of apathy when you look at a block of text that's just a little bit too long. And if you end up reading absent-mindedly, that's a great sign. And as a final note, one thing that's invaluable when producing beautiful dynamic UI is having the right set of tools. While we were working natively on iOS, we had access to Apple's core animation framework, which was fantastic, and it's basically a big part of the reason why iOS itself has always had pretty UI animations. It's certainly what allowed us to build the text flow in 80 days. So we created a similar system when we moved over to Unity, and now we've open sourced it to coincide with the talk that I did at GDC. So hopefully some of you might find that helpful. Thanks very much for listening.